What happens when a small West African nation dares to challenge the most powerful financial institutions in the world? What happens when a young soldier president, Ibrahim Traoré, says no to the cycle of debt, dependency, and foreign aid that has kept Africa tied down for decades? This is the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, who has taken the bold step the West always feared, breaking away from the International Monetary Fund and foreign aid dependency. For generations, African nations have been told they cannot survive without aid. But Ibrahim Traoré is rewriting that story, declaring that self-reliance, sovereignty, and dignity must come before handouts that often come with strings attached. Today, we take a deep dive into how Burkina Faso is charting a new course, why the West is alarmed, and what this could mean for Africa's future. Stay tuned, because this isn't just about one man, it's about the awakening of a continent. To understand Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold decision, we must first understand the trap. Since the year 1960s, international financial institutions, like the IMF and the World Bank, positioned themselves as Africa's helpers. Whenever African countries faced budget shortfalls, droughts, or crises, loans were offered. But these loans came with conditions: privatize your industries, cut social spending, open your markets to foreign companies. This was called structural adjustment, but in reality, it often weakened African economies, made them dependent on imports, and ensured they could never fully stand on their own feet. Foreign aid, too, often came with hidden costs. On the surface, it was presented as charity, but in practice, it locked countries into relationships where donors decided priorities, while African governments had little control. Roads were built, but often for mining companies, not local farmers. Schools and hospitals were promised, but underfunded, and so, many African nations remained stuck, rich in resources, but poor in independence. The West always feared that one day, an African leader would stand up and say, "We don't need this anymore." That day came with Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not your typical head of state. At just 36 years old, he rose to power through a military transition in 2022. At a time when Burkina Faso was battling terrorism, political instability, and economic despair. And like many leaders before him, Ibrahim Traoré refused to wear the crown of luxury. He rejected expensive motorcades, declined palaces, and chose to live modestly closer to the people. His speeches are direct, his tone uncompromising, and his message simple: Africa must reclaim its sovereignty. But beyond words, Captain Ibrahim Traoré began to act. He nationalized parts of Burkina Faso's gold sector, investing revenues back into the country. He launched large-scale agricultural projects, urging citizens to return to the land and produce their own food. He strengthened ties with neighboring Sahel countries, creating a new alliance based on independence rather than external control. And then came the boldest move of all, declaring that Burkina Faso would no longer rely on IMF loans or Western aid. This was not just a rejection of money, it was a rejection of a system. In 2023, whispers began to spread in Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government was considering a radical decision. By early 2024, it became clear Burkina Faso would turn away from the IMF and refuse further structural loans. For the IMF, this was shocking. For decades, Burkina Faso had been considered a compliant partner. Now, suddenly, it was refusing to play by the rules. Captain Ibrahim Traoré explained the decision clearly. IMF loans, he argued, were not gifts, they were chains. Each loan came with conditions that undermined sovereignty. Repayment often consumed more than what the nation could ever gain. Instead, he announced that Burkina Faso would use its own resources: gold, cotton, agriculture, and youth labor to fund its development. He also looked inward, calling on citizens to embrace discipline and self-reliance. "No one will build our country for us," he said in a fiery speech. "Aid will not feed us. Aid will not liberate us. Aid will not give us dignity. Only our own hands can do that." The decision rattled Western policymakers. After all, if Burkina Faso could survive without IMF loans, what would stop other African nations from following? Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew that rejecting aid could only succeed if Burkina Faso was self-sufficient, and so, he turned to the most basic pillar of survival: food security. He launched massive programs encouraging Burkina to cultivate local crops. Land was distributed to young people, farming cooperatives were formed, and government support was provided for irrigation and seeds. Instead of importing rice, wheat, and vegetables at inflated prices, the goal was to produce them locally. Captain Ibrahim Traoré called it economic independence through the soil. This agricultural revolution was not only about food, it was about pride. Farmers who once felt ignored became the backbone of national development. Villages that once relied on handouts began to feed themselves. Slowly, the idea spread. Burkina Faso did not need to beg for aid. It could grow its way out of dependency. Why does the West fear Captain Ibrahim Traoré's decision so much? Because aid is not just money, it is influence. It gives donor countries leverage over African policies, economies, and even politics. If one country breaks free, others may follow. If others follow, the entire system of dependency begins to collapse. For decades, Western powers used aid as a form of soft control, ensuring that African nations remained open markets for their goods, resources, and corporations. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rejection of the system threatens that order. It represents a dangerous idea that Africa can stand without its former colonial masters. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's defiance did not go unnoticed. Across Africa, young people celebrated his speeches, sharing his words on social media. Many began calling him the voice of a new generation of African leaders unafraid, uncompromising, and determined to reclaim sovereignty. Other nations in the Sahel, Mali, and Niger expressed similar sentiments, forming an alliance with Burkina Faso called the Alliance of Sahel States. Together, they pledged to reject foreign military bases and foreign aid traps. This Pan-African awakening is not about isolation. It's about cooperation on African terms. Captain Ibrahim Traoré envisions a continent where trade is regional, resources are shared, and development is driven internally rather than dictated from abroad. For the youth of Africa, this vision is electrifying. It challenges decades of hopelessness and dependency, replacing it with courage and pride. Of course, the road ahead is not easy. Burkina Faso faces real challenges: insecurity from armed groups, limited infrastructure, and global economic pressure. Rejecting IMF aid does not magically solve these problems, but Captain Ibrahim Traoré believes the foundation of true independence must be laid. Even if it is difficult, freedom is never given, he said. It is taken, and once taken, it must be defended. Burkina Faso's experiment will test whether a small, resource-rich African nation can chart a path without external dependency. If successful, it could inspire a wave of change across the continent. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's decision to reject IMF loans and foreign aid is more than just policy. It is a statement to the world: Africa will not remain in chains forever. For the West, it is a warning. For Africa, it is a spark of hope. The question is no longer whether aid can save Africa, the question is whether Africa can save itself. And in Burkina Faso, under a young soldier who dares to dream of sovereignty, the answer seems to be yes. This is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning of a bold experiment, an experiment that the world is watching closely, because if Burkina Faso succeeds, Africa may never be the same again. Does this mark a new chapter in African sovereignty, or a risky gamble that could backfire? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And if you want more stories like this, stories about Africa's changing power dynamics, history, and untold realities, make sure you like this video, subscribe to African Lights, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Because the resource game in Africa is changing fast.